This episode's made possible by Planful. Hello, on today's show we'll be featuring the FP&A insights and commentary of three finance leaders, including CFO Jeff Woolard of Velocity Global, CFO Aaron Alt of Cardinal Health, and CFO Bob Houghton of Pivot Bio. This is Jack Sweeney, your co-host, along with performance management guru Brett Knowles, who will serve as our resident thought leader as we seek to highlight the takeaways from our distinguished group of planning aces. We begin after this.
Hi, I'm Rowan Tonkin, Chief Marketing Officer at Planful, and we're a proud sponsor of CFO Thought Leader. At Planful, we're empowering teams just like yours to drive peak financial performance in every corner of your business. What sets Planful apart? We have purpose-built applications for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. This means we can get you up and running within weeks, and it requires minimal IT involvement. So you can rapidly and seamlessly engage everyone across the business in your key financial processes. Best of all, you can't outgrow us. We take the pain of growing away with an unmatched ability to scale with you. You have an endless runway with Planful. See why over 1,300 customers around the world choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Go to planful.com and see how you can make financial performance a team sport in your business.
Hello, it's Jack Sweeney, and I'm here with Brett Knowles. And we've been kicking these episodes off frequently by having a small chat about AI and how it's finding its way into our everyday practices. I went to my email this morning, and I have Gmail for CFO Thought Leader. There was a message that surfaced on the very top of my email list, and it was from Gemini, which is Google's, I guess they renamed Bard as Gemini, but it was offering me a special email service that would help me respond quicker, swiftly, providing text to my emails, what have you. Anyway, it was like was it a 90-day free trial or a 30-day free trial? I don't know, but I didn't want to get into it at that moment, so I just clicked dismissed. But in any case, Brett Knowles, there seems to be more of this AI functionality surfacing all the time, this time from Google, which we know wasn't the front runner here.
Yeah, so I think Microsoft has been aggressively in the working to program AI into all their tools through Copilot for 2 years. And still what we see is sort of minimal functionality. And I have to believe it's because it's the tip of the iceberg. They've got to do all the wiring that's below the water in order to begin the small stuff that breaks the surface that we see. So I'd imagine that given they've got a 2-year head start and we're not seeing much yet, it's still going to be a couple of years before, the middle of the pack and the laggards begin having the AI miracle show up like our brains can get to in a nanosecond or two.
And I think with that reason alone, they have to be talking to their customers because the customers are experimenting and discovering things on their own. And think about it, there are modestly 100,000 companies between 20 to 50 million in annual revenue. And Microsoft, if its lines of sight can see into a fairly sizable percentage of that, how it's going to quickly educate itself about where AI is getting traction and what pockets of the organization are sort of hotbeds for AI use. And as we've discussed here before, we are under the impression that FP&A, just given the problem-solving nature of the individuals who populate that realm, are among those hotbeds.
Well, we've been doing some experiments that are actually germane to the three CFOs that we're talking to this week. And it's around using our FP&A tools to uncover operational issues that we need to chase down. And part of the problem is that the information systems that we've developed that we use in FP&A are all based on that known quadrant. We know the strategy and we know the metric. And so we got a pile of data in that square. But in a standard 4x4, there's three other squares that are causing problems, right? So if you think of one axis being strategy, the left side being unknown and the right side being the known strategy, and the left side being data, and the bottom of that is unknown data, like data that's out there that we're not actually using, and then known data that's out there that we are using. And so in that top right corner, known data, known strategy, that's where, balance scorecard, OKRs, OGSM, all that stuff live. But the other three boxes are where AI can help us out. And the cheat that we used for little tiny human brains, the OKR world was try to limit yourself to three objectives because our brains can only handle so much complexity. So simplify it down to three. AI doesn't have that issue. And so that helps us hit the other three boxes where currently we don't. So an example there would be, think of Bosch with their advertising. Obviously, long before stock price was hit, the Facebook and social media numbers are going out the roof, but no one's connecting that known data to the strategy, right? That's in the bottom, unknown data, not being collected or put in context, and known strategy. So we got blindsided by that, where a whole thing's happening that in hindsight, we should have seen before. Or worse yet, where we're not collecting data about an event that's happened. So here's the experiment we did recently. We saw in one of our clients, they're getting a whole bunch of complaints, and there's nothing in that top right corner known that would indicate why we're getting those calls. Make a long story short, we asked AI to take a look, and we said, take a look for anything 2 weeks before this event that correlate to the number of complaints. Didn't see anything. Take a look a month back, didn't see anything. Take a look 6 weeks back, and what they discovered is sales had relaunched a product that had been put on the shelf for a year, but they relaunched it trying to hit some year-end numbers. And of course, there was no customer support for it. So when customers picked it up and began using it, they had questions, no documentation, nothing on the web, no customer support. Hence, the number of trouble tickets suddenly skyrocketed. But those two things weren't in that top right corner, known, because someone did something that was unknown and a bunch of data happened that was not being tracked. But AI found that, and we would have never seen it had we not asked AI to go take a look. So AI isn't limited by looking to three objectives. It can look at everything all the time. And this ability to look for, in our case, we're looking for correlation coefficients, allowed it to discover correlations that we didn't know about. And then in hindsight, go back and figure out what was causing what we saw. So I think this AI thing is going to change our world in FP&A a huge amount.
Yes, as you have mentioned here before, also you indicated there was sort of a thread that could run through our three planning aces this episode, I think related to some of this AI discussion. Is that right, or what were you talking about?
Well, what's interesting about all three, there's several things that's interesting. One thing that's interesting is they're all using FP&A tools to problem solve operational issues. So we often think of financial planning as being looking forward, yet all three stories are about looking backwards. Given what's happened and the strategy, what does the A part of FP&A tell us that we should be doing? So that analysis, and that's where the AI comes in. Like, how more powerful is our analysis capability going to be once AI creeps into the space?
Okay, then. Well, I'll tee up our first planning ace, who will be from episode 978 of CFO Thought Leader. That is Jeff Woolard, who's today CFO of Velocity Global. Jeff took a look back in time for us. It shows a pivotal moment for himself when he realized how finance could influence Intel Corporation's product roadmap. Again, he was an FP&A executive at Intel at that place and time, particularly through identifying mismatches between how products were designed and the market's buying trends. Here's what Jeff shared.
Finance is in a unique position to see across the company and find those places where you can create value. And I think that's always there, but maybe one of the moments where it hit home to me where I can see that and I can provide big impact was actually it was in the product roadmap at Intel and changing actually how we designed products. You say, well, what's a finance person doing that? It's like, well, if you look across the whole business, one of those strategic moments or strategic insights was I was looking at how people were buying our products and I was looking at how we're building them and manufacturing them. And they didn't really match in a way that could maximize margin. There was very distinctive buying trends of where people wanted to buy from a price point. And this was all PC focused, so not servers, but PC focused. You could see where people were buying, right? And it didn't change, right? The companies changed, the product life cycles changed, right? But the buying behavior sort of stayed the same. And if you looked at and if you were to map what people wanted to buy, and then you mapped what we were building, there's kind of a disconnect. And so I went and said, look, what we really need are products that have these 4 cost points. Design with these cost points in mind, because this matches the margin we need, but this matches what people are buying. This is where they want to buy. And so we started to redesign the product roadmap based on I had a name for the model of these 4 price points. And that became the objective, right? Before we would sign off on, we're going to build this product, did it hit these different 4 cost targets, which matched? And we didn't do that before, right? We just kind of built a product roadmap, but it didn't match. And that's a strategic insight of, hey, if you can see the whole business, you draw those insights and you go, hey, I change what we're building. And that's sort of strategic insight of, all right, I'm not actually designing anything. I'm not actually manufacturing anything. But that strategic insight that you can get from understanding the whole business from a finance perspective, that really changed what we built.
Some wonderful insight there for us. Again, you never know what you're going to get. And Jeff was responding to just our generic question of asking for a finance strategic moment. And he lands on this, again, looking back in time, just a great moment of insight that he experienced. Brett, what did you make of what Jeff shared?
Well, a couple of things. One that's not so obvious, I'll start with, is it's interesting that when you asked him that question, he reached back 1 or 2 jobs to get a relevant piece of experience. And the story there is, as we move forward in our careers, we're bringing along a lot of other role experience, other company experience, other situation experience that is immediately accessible to us as we're presented with a new challenge or question, in this case, a question. What I liked about Jeff had to say was the whole idea of, without structure, doing some analysis. Sorry, I'll just redo that. So without anyone asking a particular question, doing some analysis and operations and coming to an interesting conclusion. Of course, his interesting conclusion was there's a disconnect between the customer's buying behavior and what we're doing for products. So disconnect between customer facing and development operations. And we see that in almost every organization. And of course, the challenge is how to close that gap. And his story wasn't operational about how to close the gap. His story was more around what do you do when you discover that gap? As a FP&A person, what are we obligated to do? And so what's interesting is it's really focusing on the analysis side, and being a trusted advisor to our internal customers.
And again, as he explains, he goes on to sort of champion these 4 specific cost points, which reflect the market's buying preferences and the company's margin objectives. What's a little surprising to me, I was like, well, how did that happen? That sort of misalignment ever happen in the first place?
A better question would be, how could it not happen? And I say that because it happens so frequently. In almost every single organization we bump into, it's the same thing. And it's the example I said, where sales is customer facing. They've got a whole bunch of data that's happening day to day, but they don't happen to hang out with the development team or the R&D team or whoever that might be. So we're not getting the voice of the customer into the product development side, and that is amazingly common and a huge disconnect. And even if it's connected, even if there's a time lag between the two. So, we touched on the conversation of AI. There's a good example in AI where what the customer is asking for is obviously different than what's coming out of development. And Microsoft wasn't the only company that knew about AI 2 years ago, but certainly one of the organizations leading the charge in that direction. So what's different in that organization that allowed them to hear the voice of the customer, the voice of the world, and translate that into the product group faster than these other organizations?
Well, he identified the disconnect for sure, and what I'd like to know more about actually was the shift from the previous product development strategy, all of what was involved in making that happen.
Well, I would add that it's a bit like also, in golf, your follow through is almost as important as the swing itself. So the swing itself is finding the disconnect between the 4 cost points and the 4 buying points and so on. The follow through is making sure that we've enabled it in the organization, like whatever those actions were to get it done, and then stick handling, managing that execution to make sure that those changes get made. So it's not enough that our plans say to go do it, or enough that the analysis discovers we're not doing it. We've got to follow through. And once we've made those recommendations as a trusted advisor, making sure it gets done.
Well, our next planning ace will be Aaron Alt, who is CFO of Cardinal Health. Episode 983 of CFO Thought Leader, we titled his episode, The Architect of Value Creation. He looked back in time for us and shared a strategic approach taken by Target to exit the Canadian market with grace, as he described, focusing on protecting the brand, Target employees and suppliers and landlords throughout Canada as it went through a bankruptcy process. In any case, all within 4 minutes, I think here, the level of detail is just so impressive. This is Aaron Alt, CFO of Cardinal Health.
As you referenced earlier, I was an executive at Target for several years until 2018. When I joined the company in 2012, as I said, we quickly realized that we had some problems we had to go solve, and that became increasingly clear over a couple of years. And in 2014, in particular, we really started diving deep on one of the biggest problems we thought we had, which is, as a company, management had made a multi-billion-dollar bet that Target, the iconic, beloved retailer from the U.S., could move into the Canadian market seamlessly and could drive the same love of the retail experience, the same love of the Target product north of the border, as is often the case from a guest experience, within the U.S. So the company had spent billions to purchase the real estate portfolio of another failed retailer. They spent even more money to renovate every store from the floor up to the ceiling. They were unrecognizable by the time they were done, as well as building 5 new greenfield stores in new locations. They built from the ground up 3 shiny new massive distribution centers loaded with new technology that had never been tested in the target environment or indeed in some other environments, before. Bought a bunch of inventory, put it in there, created a new register system, and then flew a group of Minnesotans from Target up to Toronto to run the Canadian Target operations. Well, the short answer is that did not go terribly well, right? Notwithstanding the high hopes, notwithstanding the billions of dollars invested across the board, Target found itself in a place with empty stores, with clogged distribution centers where people couldn't find the basics to actually get it to the empty stores. Pricing was out of whack, consumers were upset, and the business was facing significant financial risk. The Target team, including me, but there was a broader team, we spent almost a year analyzing a variety of different scenarios. There were almost 50 different scenarios we analyzed of, do you exit a city? Do you exit a store? Do you go digital in parts of the country? Do you exit the entire market, right? We looked at every possible scenario and every possible gradation, but the conclusion was there was no readily identifiable path that would allow Target to have a return on its investment and allow it to avoid losing billions of dollars more in the next couple of years. Now, that's the context I would set for you. What was interesting for me from a challenge set perspective, indeed was interesting from a Target perspective, certainly, is many companies would have just cut bait. They would have said it's sunk cost, and they would have run for the hills, right? Or run back across the border and hope that everyone forgets that Target had an experience in Canada. Target didn't do that, right? What Target did, and I was a part of this team, and indeed ended up leading the execution as the CEO of Target Canada, was we decided that we were going to exit gracefully. Right? We were going to protect our brand. We were going to protect the 17,000 people that worked for Target in Canada. We were going to protect our suppliers, our landlords. We were going to do it in a way which we thought it would be much more of a graceful exit than just shutting the doors and moving on, or otherwise taking the approach that others did. And so we designed a path in finance, in partnership with strategy, in partnership with guest experience, in partnership with our HR team, discussed heavily at the board, where we would lean in. We would do something that a public company, U.S. public company, had never done, which is we would take our Canadian subsidiary and push it through a Canadian bankruptcy process, but with incremental support from the Target parent company. And so what that meant is I spent 2 years living in Toronto, working with the teams, negotiating resolutions with employees, with landlords, with suppliers, so that Target, when we did finally go back across the border and turn off the lights for the last time, we could do it with our head held high, because we were also very focused on the fact that those same Canadians that were frustrated with the Target Canada experience before that, they were coming across the border to shop at Target US, and we wanted them to keep coming to Target US because they loved our brand before the experience, and we did the right thing by the Canadians, right thing by the operation, so that we could preserve that brand loyalty and certainly protect the brand and protect the business. What I learned from that is finance is important, right? The numbers are critical. The forecast told us we had a problem, but to get to a solution on the problem, it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about the law. It was about the numbers. It was about the strategy. It was about the human element of the business challenge. And importantly, it was about the team working cross-functionally within Target as well as with our advisors to drive the best result we could for all of the stakeholders across the enterprise. That experience was incredibly intense for me. It was one of the hardest working experiences I've had, and it has stuck with me as I think about other business problems, and to really keep an eye on the fact that at the end of the day, even as CFO, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the team. It's about the strategy. It's about all the stakeholders and how do all those pieces fit together.
Just so many great takeaways there. CFO Alt, when he reflects on the misconception that C-suite positions come with absolute power, and highlights for us the importance of accountability, influence, and collaboration with teams to actually affect change. You don't get to hand these things down. He illustrates, I thought, so well. But Brett, what did you make of what Aaron Alt shared with us?
Well, first off, as a Canadian, I was very sad to hear this story. I mean, it was an incredibly interesting story hearing it from his perspective, because I know it as from the customer perspective. There's one of the Target stores was just down the street from us. So it was interesting to see what happened. And certainly the perception of how Target left was as he described it. Like, it wasn't just an absolute bail run away, which many American companies have endured trying to enter Canada. But certainly interesting to hear his perspective. Now, again, it's almost the same story as Jeff's, just with different actors. Again, he's reaching back in his career. You asked him a question. His answer wasn't what happened yesterday or week before. It was in 2 or 3 positions ago, what it is we went through. And so that's one thing, is again, back to the sub story of our 3 thought leaders this week is about your whole career is part of what you bring to every day at work, not just what happened this week or last week. Second part, of course, is did the analysis, did the discovery, observe what the problem was, made the recommendations, and an even more active involvement in making sure it happened. Like being here in Canada for a couple of years, making sure that exit was sort of ethical and legal and human centric and so on. As FP&A people, we don't often think about that follow through, but like we were in the first story, in golf, the follow through is almost as important as the swing itself.
Yes, and I'll just point out again, that was from episode 983 of CFO Thought Leader. The full episode is worth listening to because he's really got a number of challenges he's addressing within Cardinal Health, which currently has sort of an activist environment. A number of the members of the board are activist investors at this point in time. And he was brought in by the CEO to help put forth this mandate of creating value, and how the words he chooses to explain the approach, the strategy is just, there's a lot of thought behind it. And it's clearly someone who's vastly experienced in this realm. And I think that's in part why he shared this story about what he undertook at Target and the outcome, because I think it was opening the lens a little bit as to what he's up to at Cardinal Health.
Well, I would, embellish what you're saying by, I think his definition of value is different than what we think of initially in the FP&A world. Like, it's not about dollar value. Like he hit it on the head about the billions of dollars that was invested, but the story quickly moved on to the 17,000 Canadian employees and about, respecting the landlords and the agreements that they had, making sure that what they did was not only legally correct and going through the Canadian bankruptcy process, but which is a very humanistic one, but also making sure that the human capital is rightly dealt with and the strategy is rightly dealt with and so on. So it's way beyond, the FP&A role is way beyond just financial planning and analysis. In his case, it's about the value. And a lot of what he was doing was building the brand value. Like, he was clear that he doesn't want to damage the Target brand, because we all drive over to Buffalo now to go get our Target stuff. And he doesn't want that opportunity to go away as well. So just a broader context.
Well, speaking of brands, our next planning ace has some insight into the General Mills enterprise. Our next planning ace is, of course, Bob Houghton, CFO of Pivot Bio, spent nearly 15 years inside General Mills. Upon joining the largest and most profitable division at General Mills, Houghton tells us he expected the operations to be smooth, but instead found significant opportunities for improvement, particularly in execution. Here's the anecdote he shared with us.
Yeah, so Jack, find a strategic moment. For me, there's one that's very clear, and we'll go back to my days at General Mills. And I had just moved into a division within General Mills it was the biggest division in the company, and the most profitable. And I'd made the assumption that everything would be working perfectly smooth and there wouldn't be a lot of opportunity to have impact. And what I found when I came into that role was that there wasn't enough conversation about the specific steps that would need to be executed to enable the vision for the division. So when I got to the division, the strategies were things like, grow volume and increase margin. And from my perspective, Jack, those are outcomes. Those aren't strategies. You do things to enable those outcomes. So what I observed was that the division just wasn't executing very well. So I went online and said, I'd love to find a book on execution. So I keyed in the word execution, and not surprisingly, Execution, The Discipline of Getting Things Done by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan is the first book that showed up. And that book does a fantastic job of talking about how mission and vision statements aren't enough, that you need to have strategies and very, very specific action plans that enable the strategies, that enable the mission and vision. You need all of those components to be successful. And it absolutely resonated and struck a chord with me. And it was what the division was lacking. So I put together a 2-day offsite with the finance organization. We went through all the concepts of what was in that book, how we would apply them to help that division become more profitable, more successful. So we did 1-day offsite, and we did 1 day applying those learnings back within the organization. And between that and some other initiatives that were underway in the 2 years I was in that role, we were able to increase the profitability of that division by $100 million in 2 years and gain a full point of market share in a very, very competitive category.
That's a pretty nice return for a 2-day offsite, if that's the largest contributor to that. That's just a remarkable story. Brett, what did you make of what Bob Houghton shared?
Well, yes, as you pointed out, what's interesting about Bob is he also reached back into his career. Again, I'm emphasizing that as we show up day to day, we're bringing along 20, 30 years of experience. And again, it's all about execution. In fact, he's taken it to the point where he looked it up on the web and came up with, the execution, the discipline of getting things done, which is an awesome book that we should all be reading. That is going well beyond even the A part of FP&A to the follow through. What is it that we need to make sure, and how is that different than our day-to-day jobs as FP&A people? And it's a different mindset, it's a different action, and a different follow through. Again, metaphor of the golf swing, that the follow through is just as important. And he was pretty clear with his team that it wasn't the execution, it wasn't the analysis, it was all about the follow through that was important. And that was a skill set that he needed to bring to his team. And I think it's a great example of how it is we add value to organizations. In his case, it was easy, right? He came back and said, added $100 million to the bottom line inside of 2 years. Like, those are impressive numbers that he got not by cutting a better plan or by doing a better analysis. He got it by doing better follow through.
And follow through is what it sounds like. It's about following and making sure steps are taken to correct what might be broken, and making certain that the organization is behaving differently if it's an issue related to how the team's deployed or what have you. How am I doing?
Yeah, it's what we saw with Aaron is boots on the ground. He's going to go to Canada. He's going to live there for 2 years and make this go through. Same strategy, different actions. Bob, again, discovered that there's a competency gap in his team. Wasn't about F, wasn't about A, wasn't about P. It was all about execution, which isn't part of the FP&A acronym, but that's what he realized his team needed to bring to the table. And his metric of success wasn't about how good the plan was or how good the strategy was, how good the analysis was. His metric, how he measured victory, was an absolute revenue to the business. Well, what an interesting way to take a look at FP&A. How many of your listeners, your FP&A people, say, I want to be measured at the end of this year by how much revenue I brought to the bottom line? Wouldn't that be interesting?
I have to say, that's one of your more provocative thoughts. That, and how you months ago talked about how ChatGPT pulled up a chair at the FP&A table, which I want to touch on prompts with you. If there was a prompt, what are some obvious ones that FP&A people could be using as they experiment? What are they doing? What do you suspect they're up to?
Well, I would say that I'm gonna stab at it and say there's 4 classes of prompts that you need to work on. One is along the classification of what I would call what needs to be right, or what would need to be true. So in the FP&A world, we're creating scenarios in our brains, and we come up with a plan. Well, the plan is based on the assumptions, but it goes beyond it. So an interesting question to ask, Chat, is what would need to be true for this plan to be successful? Or, what are the failure points of this would be another example. So what would need to be true is one class of prompts. A second class of prompt is about the risks. So what are the primary risks? And again, you've got to model it, say, given our capital structure and the free cash flow and all the other attributes of our business, what are the risks of this plan? So that we're not limited by our brain's consideration of what those risks might be. Third is I'm going to call scenario. So, and actually 3 and 4 scenarios. One is asking ChatGPT to create some scenarios for you to test your model. And then the other is, given this model, what scenarios come out of it. So part of the issue with planning, that expression that every plan fails on first contact with the enemy. There are 3 attributes to that model that cause us grief all the time. Part 1 is we create plans without absolute knowledge. And so the gap between what you actually know and what you think you know is one gap in planning. So you almost have to get some prompts around that. The second gap in planning is between what you plan to do and what the organization actually does. And we call that the analysis part of FP&A. Second set of prompts about that. Then the third part is, how does the world react to what you've done? So let's say you go in, if we go back to Jeff's case, I come up with now 4 cost points that we're going to go hit with our product, and we take that to market. But we assume the world's going to storm our gates with that. But what if the competition comes up with 4 better price points, or 8 price points, or something else? That his whole model is ignoring what the competition might do given the work that he's done. So the prompts, those 4 prompt sets, form around those 3 possible gaps in the planning world. And the dilemma is those gaps exist always, but we bring to it our limited human brains of experience and our careers. And our career of 20, 30 years that we bring to the table sounds impressive as we hear these stories from Jeff and Aaron and Bob, but that's pretty infinitesimal compared to the years of experience that Chat brings to the table. So we don't have to show up just with 30 years of experience. We now have to show up with 300,000 years of experience in order to be that one step ahead of the competition.
Wow. And I almost wasn't going to ask you the question about prompts. Next time, I know my rule of thumb is just ask. When Brett's here, just ask. Anyway, Brett, any final thoughts on our 3 planning aces this episode?
Well, so, what I would conclude from these 3 is how important it is that day to day that we're not limiting ourselves by what's happening in this organization this week, this day, this month, but we remember that deep history of experience that we have. And sometimes that's tough to do, right? Because you're in the middle of a conversation and you're in the present moment. It's tough to stop for a second and sort of reflect on that longer history of what comes to the table. And the second part, which is equally difficult, is stepping beyond your perception of your job. These are 3 men that in each case step beyond the perception of FP&A. And in this case, the common part was in follow through well beyond the world of finance, right? They stepped into the world of sales. They stepped into the world of development. They stepped in the world of, bankruptcy in Canada. So we create these artificial boundaries on how we work as FP&A. And sometimes people are territorial. They don't want us stepping on their turf, but you can see what happens when you do. You bring huge value to the organization when you bring your depth of history, but also stepping beyond the limitations of a traditional FP&A model.
Very nice, Brett. Thank you once again for putting like we like to say, put a bow on it for us. But it occurs to me as we opened up, I didn't ask you about where you been. What are you up to?
Well, where I've been is a good question. What's interesting is where I've been this year is way more, where my brain has traveled to than where my body's traveled to. So last year we saw a huge amount of on-site requests coming in. This year they seem to have dried up, and people are still looking for the support, but they're looking at it in web meetings. And what think I'm seeing is almost the bounce back, right? With COVID and how we're all strapped down, when we're suddenly free to meet again, we all went crazy. Now we realize we had those face-to-face meetings, but the web ones are almost as productive, but a whole bunch less expensive and give us a whole bunch more time. So even if a web meeting is only 75% as productive as an in-person meeting, since it takes about 1/4 of the time, I could actually have that same meeting 4 times and still break even. So I think the equation that we're seeing is we have learned a different element of the modern way of working, which has a much higher index of web meetings than in-person meetings, just because of cost and time issues.
Nice. Always some great takeaways for us by just asking you what you're up to and your observations about how your own professional life might be changing. Brett Knowles, thank you for another interesting episode.
Okay, my friend. Well, we'll chat with you in like a month's time.